had many people tell me, well, believing in God is for weak people. It's a crutch.
Mm-hmm.
And the assumption is that you can have some kind of a spiritual life that doesn't require, that doesn't have specific requirements for health in a way that you would never expect that for your physical body. You don't consider food a crutch. You don't consider water a crutch. You don't consider shelter a crutch, but you're not going to survive without them.
Welcome back, friends, to Conversations with Jewish Believers in Jesus. So, what is it about the God of the Bible that bothers us? Is it that he can see everything we do? Is it that he's judgmental and we don't want a God that judges us? Is it because we simply want to live however we want with no moral consequences? Or is it because we feel like belief in God is a crutch? Well, whatever the reason, our guest, Ruth Rosen, writer and author with a degree in biblical studies from Biola College, will be dealing with people's hesitancy to put their faith in God and addressing those reasons. Hey, Ruth, I'm so glad you're here. I've been really enjoying our conversation so far.
Thanks, Jeff. Me too.
Yeah, I love the testimony that you shared. If you haven't seen it, go check it out on the channel. I'm excited about the topic that we're going to talk about today. The more I speak with Jewish people here in Israel and all around the world, I've been hearing why people just don't believe or want to believe in the God of the Bible. Can you tell us what you've learned over the decades that could help people understand why following the God of the Bible is so hard for people?
Well, I think there's a number of reasons. First of all, there's very few things in life that you can say, 110%. There's always an element of faith in what we believe, whether it's the God of the Bible or the God of our own imaginations. There's at some point, to say that I'm absolutely certain with no doubts ever.
Yeah.
And there are things in the Bible that I still struggle with.
Of course.
And I think that all of us who believe do. I think what it comes down to is you're always going to have to struggle with whatever it is that you believe, because there's always going to be some problem with whatever you believe.
Yeah. Good point.
There's always going to be something that doesn't quite add up, or something that's paradoxical, or something that you just can't identify with. And I think that the difference between believing in the God of the Bible versus how we imagine God to be, I think is that matter of identity, which is actually kind of interesting, because a lot of people will say, well, I just can't believe in a God who, blank and blank, and then they'll quote something from the Bible.
Right.
And so the point then becomes, who am I based on what God I believe in, rather than who actually is God and how can I know him?
Yeah.
And I do think that a lot of people haven't actually read the Bible. And so therefore, a lot of people have kind of cherry-picked portions of it that they really can't identify with. And I'll be honest, there's a few things in the Bible that I can't identify with either. And, some of them are historical, cultural, or whatever. For some of them, there are explanations. For others, there are not explanations. And we just have to kind of figure that if God is real, he's infinite. And we as finite beings are never going to completely understand everything about him. But he reveals enough that we do understand that we can believe that he's good, that we can believe that he keeps his promises. There's certain things that he shows us throughout the Bible that make it to be enough if you're open to what God is going to reveal about himself, and the fact that he's not going to reveal everything to your satisfaction or to my satisfaction, that there's always going to be. So I think a lot of it is a matter of identity. And I think a lot of people who say, I could never believe in a God who, fill in the blank.
Right.
It's almost like they feel like believing in God is joining a club. And they're saying, well, in my club, this is how we operate, and I don't like that club over there because that's how they operate. But in reality, God is who he is, whether or not we believe in him.
Yep.
And whether or not we like it. And the Bible says that we automatically don't like it because he's in charge and we're not.
Yes. Yeah. I talked to a lot of people, and honestly, I just be honest. I loved, before coming to faith, I loved being the God of my own world. I loved it until it wrecked me. You know, in my 20s, oh, it's great. I'm single. I'm traveling the world, and I can create my own reality, and you know, we're all God, and I'm a piece of God, and I can just do whatever I want and have spirituality with really no moral consequences. And I loved that until my philosophy and my reality were just a billion miles apart, and I was trying to maintain my own happiness with the weight of this, I would call religious legalism that I created on my shoulders, that I couldn't carry any longer, and it completely destroyed me. And so I used to live in all those cliches. You know, I don't want a God that's judgmental. I want to be spiritual and with no moral consequences. I don't want someone looking at me and seeing everything that I do. And so I lived like that. And so after coming to faith and God giving me a spirit, which gave me a sound mind to be able to see the difference, those cliches just dissolved immediately. Not saying that I don't ever struggle. Of course I do. But I lived in cliches like crazy, but never had depth in them.
Yeah. And I think that there are a number of cliches that are at work very naturally, you know, in us as human beings. And I think when somebody says, well, I could never believe in a God who, and then they fill in a blank from something that was cherry picked from the Bible, I think that there's a sense of self-sufficiency, like I am enough to decide who I want to be.
Right.
I don't need God to help me be a moral person. I don't need God to help me be a nice person or good to my neighbors. And actually for a lot of people that's very true.
Right.
But there's still the reality that if God is real, he has a say in our lives, so that everything can be good and fine on a horizontal, but there's still the vertical
That's right.
that we need to worry about. And so, you know, people will say, well, I don't need God in order to blank and blank. Or it used to be really common for people to say, and I've had many people tell me, you know, well, believing in God is for weak people, it's a crutch.
Mm-hmm.
And the assumption is that you can have some kind of a spiritual life that doesn't require, you know, that doesn't have specific requirements for health in a way that you would never expect that for your physical body. You know, you don't consider food a crutch. You don't consider water a crutch. You don't consider shelter a crutch, but you're not going to survive without them. You don't consider love even a crutch. Well, I mean, I guess some people do, but they're the most unhappy people in the world. You know, we need love, but then that starts to get into the spiritual. We have, just like we have physical needs, we have spiritual needs, and it is not a crutch to look to have those spiritual needs met. And when we think that we know how to nourish ourselves spiritually, it's kind of like, you know, being a little kid who's like, you know, well, of course, you know, chocolate for dinner is a good idea.
I asked my middle son the other day, I said, if I let you eat anything that you would you do that? He said, oh yeah, I totally would. And, you know, he'd choose junk, you know, candy and cake. He would just go for it. I don't know how long he'd last doing that, but, you know, I asked him straight up and he said, yep, I'd do it.
And then when you're full of that stuff, you don't have an appetite for the stuff that really nourishes you. And it's the same. You know, we fill ourselves up, you know, on spiritual, you know, fluff.
Right.
When we don't have that appetite for something more nourishing.
Good point. I mean, I think I would be willing to say that my faith in God is a crutch in a way, but it's a crutch that I can't hold myself up without him. I need him. You know, people say, "Oh, you're a good person," and I'm like, I'm really, honestly, maybe in society's terms, maybe I'm a good person, but, you know, in spiritual terms, I'm a horrible person, honestly. And I don't say that, you know, in terms of like self-hate. I'm not like hating myself. what I'm doing is realizing my need for a holy God to make me into something that I'm not and that I can't do on my own.
Yeah. And that's very countercultural,
Right. Right.
because we're encouraged to have these delusions of autonomy. Why? Well, because if we decide, what's going to make us happy and fulfilled, then we'll be attracted to buy whatever people want to sell us and spend our money. And, if it's all up to me, then, let's go shopping, you know.
Right.
Um, and
Yeah.
and I mean shopping metaphorically, but but we're kind of conditioned, especially I think in the West, to feel like anything less than autonomy somehow robs us of dignity. But if we're created in God's image, as I believe that we are, God is other oriented, and he's also sovereign. So if we're made in his image, we're like him, but we are not him. So we also are other oriented, but we're not sovereign. And so wanting to be autonomous is, well, again, it's the same mistake that
I'm gonna to your point. I was 24 when I sold all my possessions, broke up with my girlfriend, bought a one-way ticket to Israel. I'd never been out of the United States to that point, but I knew I needed to change my life. And so me coming to faith would be a little bit over 20 years later. But when I flew to Israel, I was in this really odd spiritual occult mindset, and I landed in Israel, went down to a kibbutz in the southern Negev, the southern desert, and I was in a community of about 800 people, 700 or 800 people, and I would take walks around at night, look up at the stars, and I would say to myself, nobody that I know knows where I am right now. Wow, what an amazing feeling. I wanted that autonomy so bad because I wanted to break free from authority, break free from the control of society, control of not knowing that I was actually in another society, but just decide for myself where I was going to be and what I was going to do. And I loved that feeling until, this is kind of like a little warning, until I realized that I could no longer relate to people. I had a very difficult time in relationships, very difficult time communicating, because I was always trying to be autonomous and other than, instead of needing others. I don't need anyone. I'm just fine by myself. And like I said before, I was great in my 20s, but when I got to be 40 with a wife and kids and a business and everything, I was ruined because I'm in complex relationships and not knowing how to deal with them.
Yeah. Yeah. Being self-contained, we weren't designed for that.
Yeah, indeed. And when I first learned that, God had been in relationship since, for eternity, that made so much sense as to why we need so much to be in relationship. So, thank you so much for sharing that. And so thank you, Ruth, for being with us. Stay tuned for our next episode with Ruth. To find out more about Ruth and her work, click on the link below in the description and stay tuned for our next episode, where Ruth and I will be discussing how she finds meaning and hope in what can sometimes seem like a meaningless and hopeless existence. To find out more about Jews for Jesus, you can visit us and even chat with us anonymously at our website, jewsforjesus.org. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. And may you all find peace and hope in our Messiah, Yeshua.